33. That number is not a coincidence. 33 years of life, 33 works I am going to show you today. Each one created by a different genius in different eras with completely distinct techniques, beliefs, and stories. And yet, all of them pointing toward the same face. You have probably seen some of these images before, in books, in museums, on a church wall, or scrolling past your feed without even stopping. But seeing is not the same as truly looking. Today, you are going to truly look, because behind each of these canvases, there is something that museum labels never tell you. Rivalries, secrets hidden in the brushstrokes, artists who defied the church, works that were almost destroyed, painters who spent their entire lives trying to capture something that perhaps no canvas can ever contain. 33 works, 700 years of history, and one question that none of them fully answers, but that all of them ask in a way that will stay with you for a long time. Let us start at the beginning. At the moment when Western art decided that representing Christ was not just a religious obligation, it was a human challenge work one, Lamentation of Christ, Giotto di Bondone, 1304 to 1306. Before Giotto, sacred figures had no weight. They were flat, golden, distant, as if humanity were an imperfection that art needed to correct. Giotto ended that. In the Cappella degli Scroveni in Padua, he painted the body of Christ being lowered with a gravity that no one had attempted before. Mary holds her son with a mother's arms. The apostles weep with their faces buried in their hands. Even the angels in the sky seem to break apart with grief. What few people know is that this work was commissioned by a man named Enrico Scrovegni, the son of a usurer so notorious for greed that Dante placed him in hell. The entire chapel was built as an act of atonement for his father's dirty money. Art born from guilt, and that changed the history of the world. Giotto produced dozens of scenes from the life of Christ throughout his career, but it is here, in this lamentation, that everything changes. For the first time, you do not observe the pain. You feel it. Work 2, Descent from the Cross. Rogier van der Weyden, 1435. 100 years later, a Flemish painter named Rogier van der Weyden looked at the crucifixion and made a choice that few artists had the courage to make. He placed pain at the center, not glory, not light, raw pain. In this canvas of nearly 3 meters, the body of Christ comes down from the wood with the real weight of a dead man. Mary faints. John steadies her. Mary Magdalene holds back tears with a tension visible in her jaw. The unsettling detail: the bodies of Mary and Christ form exactly the same curve. Mother and son, same position, same surrender, as if suffering had a mirror. Van der Weyden spent his life producing scenes of the Passion of Christ, but none with the emotional brutality of this one. They say he wept while painting it. There is no way to prove that, but there is something in this canvas that makes you believe it. Work 3. Noli me tangere. Fra Angelico, 1440 to 1442. Do not touch me. Fra Angelico was a Dominican friar who only painted after praying. He believed that to represent the sacred, the painter first needed to become sacred. In this work, the risen Christ steps back gently as Mary Magdalene reaches out to touch him in the garden. The gesture is almost a dance, delicate, impossible to describe in words. What scholars debate to this day: Christ is holding a spade. He is disguised as a gardener, and Mary only recognizes him at the moment he speaks her name. Fra Angelico decorated more than 40 cells of the convent of San Marco with scenes from the life of Christ, one for each monk to meditate upon, each one different, each one painted as if it were the only one he would ever make. There is humility in abundance when the abundance comes from devotion. Work 4. The Baptism of Christ. Piero della Francesca, 1448. Piero della Francesca was a mathematician before he was a painter, and that dual formation created something no other artist had attempted: a sacred scene with the cold precision of an equation. The light is uniform. The figures are almost motionless. The dove hovers frozen in the air, defying physics with a stillness that seems calculated. What Piero painted was not the baptism itself. It was the second before, the silence that exists between what was and what is about to be. There is a detail most people miss. In the background, a man is undressing to be baptized next, creating a timeline within the painting itself: past, present, and future coexisting in the same space. Piero was obsessed with perspective and proportion, but here he used all that precision to paint something mathematics never managed to capture: the weight of a moment that changes everything. Work 5. The Agony in the Garden. Giovanni Bellini, 1465. Gethsemane, the night before the arrest, the moment when, according to the Gospels, Christ asked that the cup might pass from him. Bellini painted this with the most specific shade of blue that exists, that tone of sky that only appears in the final minutes before dawn, when night has not yet left, but day has already begun to arrive. The disciples sleep. The soldiers' torches appear in the distance, still far away, and Christ is alone on a rock with an expression that is not fear. It is the expression of someone who has already decided and is now simply waiting. Bellini came from a family of Venetian painters and produced countless works on the Passion of Christ over decades. But this specific agony, this instant between decision and consequence, he returned to more than once, as if he could not leave that garden behind. Some moments stay with us like that, regardless of belief. There is a pattern that begins to emerge in this timeline. The greatest painters in history did not choose the moments of glory. They chose the moments of limit. And the further down this list you go, the clearer that choice becomes. Work 6. Christ Crowned with Thorns. Hans Memling, 1470. Hans Memling was German, but it was in Bruges, the wealthiest city in 15th century Europe, that he built his reputation and his obsession. Throughout his career, Memling painted scenes of the Passion of Christ dozens of times, not as commissions, as a necessity. In this work, Christ sits after the crowning of thorns, humiliated, alone, eyes cast down. But what unsettles you is not the pain. It is the stillness. There is no scream, no revolt. There is a dignity that no tormentor managed to take away. There is a remarkable technical detail. Memling painted each thorn individually with a precision that required hours of work for centimeters of canvas, as if each thorn needed to be taken seriously, as if pain itself deserved that attention. Work 7. Adoration of the Magi. Sandro Botticelli, 1475. Botticelli was the Medici family's favorite painter, the most powerful family in Florence. And in this work, he did something that caused a silent scandal lasting centuries. He placed the faces of the Medici as the three wise men who adore the infant Christ: Lorenzo de' Medici, his brother Giuliano, members of the family, all there, kneeling before the child, in a city where that gesture was equivalent to declaring them the most important men in the known world. Was it flattery? Was it veiled criticism of power that bows before the sacred only when convenient? Was it both at once? Botticelli left no answer, but he included himself in the canvas. In the right corner, looking directly at the viewer, like someone who knows exactly what he has done and is not afraid of being seen. Work 8. Lamentation over the Dead Christ. Andrea Mantegna, 1483. There is an Italian word, scorciatura, that describes the effect of foreshortening figures in extreme perspective. Mantegna did not invent this technique, but he used it here in a way no one had attempted before, and that permanently changed the relationship between painting and viewer. The body of Christ is laid out with his feet pointing directly at you. The nail marks are visible on the soles of his feet. The torso extends in forced perspective. Beside him, Mary and John grieve with the exhaustion of those who have run out of tears. Only silence remains. What Mantegna did was place the viewer inside the scene. You are not looking at a painting. You are standing beside the body. This work was never sold in his lifetime. It was found in Mantegna's studio after his death, as if he could not bring himself to let it go, as if there was something there he had not yet finished understanding. Work 9. Christ Carrying the Cross. Hieronymus Bosch. 15 and 10. Bosch saw the world in a way that frightened those around him, and that fear he provoked appears in every canvas he ever made. In this work, the face of Christ carrying the cross is completely surrounded, pressed in by a crowd of grotesque faces, distorted, almost inhuman. Faces that scream, that laugh, that display a cruelty that goes beyond any specific era. And at the center of it all, Christ, with his eyes half shut, not from weakness, from a deliberate distance from the horror around him. Bosch produced an entire universe of works on judgment, sin, and redemption, and scholars still debate whether he was a deeply devout man or a fierce critic of the church of his time, perhaps both at once. What no one disputes is that this canvas still disturbs, because the faces surrounding Christ do not belong to the 16th century. You have seen them before, in other contexts, in other centuries. Work 10, The Last Supper. Leonardo da Vinci, 1495 to 1498. Everyone knows this image. It is on mugs, on restaurant walls, in memes. And that is precisely why most people have never truly seen it. Leonardo spent 3 years on this work, not painting, thinking. Sometimes he would stand motionless before the wall for days without touching the brush. The prior of the convent complained. Leonardo replied that the moments of contemplation were part of the work. What he was building was not a scene. It was a question distributed across 13 faces. Christ announces that he will be betrayed, and each of the 12 apostles reacts differently: anger, denial, fear, confusion, guilt, in 12 simultaneous reactions to the same instant. There is a detail few notice. In the middle of all that emotional chaos, Christ is completely still, arms open, face serene, like someone who knew and chose to be there anyway. There is also a mystery that survives to this day. Leonardo never finished the face of Judas. He left it open. They say he wandered the worst neighborhoods of Milan looking for a face that could represent betrayal. He never found one real enough. We have arrived at the 16th century, and the world was in upheaval. The Protestant Reformation had split Christianity in two. The Catholic Church was trying to reassert itself through art, commissioning larger, more dramatic, more impossible to ignore works. And artists, caught in the middle of that war, needed to choose sides. Some obeyed. Others used the brush like a scalpel. Work 11, Christ Crucified. Albrecht Dürer, 1511. Dürer was German at a time when being German and an artist meant being at the epicenter of the Reformation. A personal friend of Martin Luther, he lived the religious rupture not as a spectator, but as someone who needed to decide what he believed through his own work. This engraving of the crucifixion is part of a series he called The Large Passion. 15 images on the suffering of Christ, produced over years with a technical precision that still astonishes specialists today. What sets Dürer apart is texture. Every line of Christ's body was carved with a needle into wood, hundreds of marks that together create light, shadow, and weight without a single drop of colored paint. Dürer produced 3 complete series on the Passion of Christ. 3. As if each time he finished, he realized there was something he had still not managed to say. Work 12, The Transfiguration. Raphael Sanzio, 15. 20 Raphael died at 37, and this was the last work he painted. It was found unfinished in his studio when the body was still warm, and it was displayed beside the coffin during the wake, as if death had entered the final composition uninvited. The canvas shows 2 moments simultaneously. Above, Christ floats in light between Moses and Elijah, while 3 apostles are struck down by the vision. Below, a desperate crowd tries to heal a possessed boy and cannot. Raphael was saying something about the human condition. The sacred exists. Transformation is possible. But while it happens up above, the chaos continues down below, and we, almost always, are in the lower half of the canvas. The rivalry between Raphael and Michelangelo was known throughout Florence and Rome. Michelangelo said Raphael had learned everything he knew by copying others. Raphael responded with silence. And with works like this one, Work 13, The Last Judgment. Michelangelo, 1541. Michelangelo was 66 years old when he finished this work. His body was destroyed. His faith, as he wrote in letters, was more complicated than when he was young. The Last Judgment covers the entire altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. It is chaotic, dense, and disturbing. Christ at the center is not the gentle shepherd of traditional iconography. He is a muscular young man with his arm raised in a gesture that seems to condemn as much as to save. The church was scandalized. The figures were too naked, too human. A cardinal called the work a thing of the bathroom. Michelangelo responded by including that cardinal's face among the damned in hell. But the most unsettling detail is the figure of Saint Bartholomew, who holds his own flayed skin in his hand. The face on that skin is Michelangelo's self-portrait, a man who placed himself among the damned as confession or as warning. Work 14, Conversion of Mary Magdalene, Paolo Veronese, 1548. Veronese was Venetian, and Venice had a relationship with the church that was, let us say, negotiated. He painted biblical scenes with the exuberance of someone who does not believe the sacred needs to be austere. Lavish banquets, rich garments, monumental architecture, and Christ in the middle of all that. Not as a figure of suffering, but as a presence that transforms. In this work, Mary Magdalene abandons a life of luxury upon hearing Christ preach. The contrast is deliberate. She is surrounded by jewels and expensive fabrics, and still she looks beyond all of it. What Veronese understood, and that many religious painters refused, is that conversion does not happen far from the world. It happens inside it, in the middle of excess. At the moment, something more true cuts through everything that is superficial. The Inquisition summoned Veronese to testify more than once for his artistic liberties. He replied that painters had the same freedom as poets and madmen. Work 15. Christ in the Garden of Olives. El Greco. 1590. El Greco was Greek. He studied in Venice, and he went to Spain when no other place would have him, because his style was considered flawed. Figures too elongated, colors too unreal, space too distorted. Centuries later, Van Gogh, Cézanne, and the German Expressionists would recognize him as one of their greatest forerunners. But in his lifetime, El Greco painted at the margins. He returned to the theme of the Garden of Gethsemane multiple times, as if that moment of absolute solitude had something he needed to keep trying to understand. The sky in this version is an impossible yellow-green. The entire landscape seems twisted by the same anguish Christ carries. And the disciples sleep in the background, as always. Work 16, Ecce Homo. Caravaggio, 1605. Caravaggio had killed a man. He was fleeing Rome with a death sentence over his head, and still, or perhaps because of it, he painted Christ with a humanity that no other artist had reached. Ecce homo. Behold the man, the words of Pilate presenting the flogged Christ to the crowd. Caravaggio used his chiaroscuro, that brutal contrast between light and shadow, to do something simple and devastating. The light falls only on the face of Christ. Everything around it disappears into darkness, as if to say, "Stop, look only at this. Nothing else in this room matters now." Caravaggio produced dozens of scenes of Christ and the apostles throughout his career, always with that same choice of humanizing the sacred to the point of discomfort, always using models taken from the street, always with dirt under the fingernails of his figures. The church refused some of these works. Caravaggio sold them to private collectors. And the paradox is that exactly those, the refused ones, are today the most valuable. The Baroque arrived as a response. The Church had lost half of Europe to the Protestant Reformation and needed to win hearts back. The strategy was simple. Make art speak louder than any sermon, more drama, more light, more flesh, more pain. And it worked. Work 17. The Descent from the Cross. Peter Paul Rubens. 1612 to 1614, Rubens was a diplomat, a polyglot, a regular at royal courts, a man of the world who was also one of the greatest painters of the 17th century, and who painted Christ with a physical energy that is still difficult to believe came from a brush. This work has 3 panels. The central one measures more than 6 meters in height. And what Rubens did there was something few artists had attempted, showing the real weight of a dead human body being removed from the cross. This is not metaphor. It is physics. It is gravity. You can almost feel the effort of the hands holding the body. But the detail that stops any person, regardless of belief, is Mary's gesture. She is below, with her arms reaching upward. It is not a religious gesture. It is the gesture of a mother wanting to hold her son one last time. Rubens had lost his wife shortly before beginning this work. Some historians believe that loss is inside the canvas. There is no way to prove it, but there is something there that goes beyond the commission. Work 18. Christ Crucified, Diego Velázquez. 1632. Black background. One figure. Silence. Velázquez was the official painter of King Philip IV of Spain, a man accustomed to portraying power, wealth, and grandeur. And then he painted this: no crowd, no soldiers, no angel, no narrative. Just Christ on the cross against absolute darkness. Velázquez removed everything that was context and left only the question. A man, a cross. What do you do with that? What few know is that this work was possibly commissioned as a public declaration of faith. Velázquez was under investigation by the Inquisition for alleged associations with converted Jews. The painting would be his proof of Christian devotion. If that is true, it is one of the most disturbing ironies in art history. One of the most genuinely spiritual works of the 17th century may have been born from political obligation. Art finds the truth through the most crooked paths. Work 19. The Resurrection of Lazarus. Rembrandt van Rijn. 1630. Rembrandt was 24 years old when he painted this work, and he already knew how to do something that takes a lifetime to learn: illuminate the invisible. The scene is from the Gospel of John. Christ before the tomb of Lazarus, 4 days dead, calling him back to life. Rembrandt painted the exact moment Lazarus begins to rise, half inside, half outside the tomb, half between worlds. The light falls on Christ in a way that seems to come from within him, not from outside. And the figures around him react with a mixture of terror and astonishment that Rembrandt captured like no one else. What makes this work singular is what is in the faces of the witnesses. It is not joy, it is something more complicated, as if the resurrection were at once a miracle and a disturbance, something that forces the world to reorganize itself around a possibility no one was ready to accept. Rembrandt returned to the theme of Christ and the miracles throughout his entire career, producing hundreds of works on the life and passion of Christ between paintings, engravings, and drawings. Even when he lost everything, he continued. Work 20. Pietà. Gustave Moreau. 1876. The 19th century arrived with Darwin, with industrialization, with the beginning of the end of religious certainty. And Gustave Moreau responded to all of it by plunging deep into the sacred, not from naive faith, from the need for beauty in a world that was becoming increasingly mechanical. In this Pietà, Mary holds the dead body of Christ with a visual richness that goes beyond the religious. It is almost archaeological. Jewelry, fabrics, ornaments. Moreau researched ancient cultures, mythologies, symbols from various civilizations, and wove them all into his own language. What he painted is not just a mother's grief. It is the grief of a world that has lost something it cannot name. Moreau was a teacher to both Henri Matisse and Georges Rouault, two of the greatest artists of the 20th century. And what he gave them was not technique. It was the courage to take the sacred seriously in an era when that was out of fashion. Work 21. The Light of the World. William Holman Hunt, 1851. Victorian England was a place of formal certainties and doubts that no one had the courage to say aloud. William Holman Hunt was part of the pre-Raphaelite movement, a group of painters who believed art had gone wrong after Raphael and needed to return to its origins. More detail, more honesty, more presence. In this work, Christ stands before a door covered in ivy and weeds, holding a lantern, knocking. The door has no handle on the outside. Hunt explained the symbolism in letters. The door can only be opened from within. Christ does not enter uninvited. The choice always belongs to whoever is on the other side. This image was reproduced thousands of times and carried to every corner of the British Empire, from churches in England to missions in Africa and Asia. Hunt was so disturbed by the poor quality of the reproductions that he painted a larger version decades later to ensure the work reached the world in the right way. He spent 8 years on that second version, with his eyesight deteriorating, nearly blind by the end. Still, he finished it. The 19th century was the century of doubt. Darwin had published The Origin of Species. Science was advancing, cities were growing, and the faith that had organized European life for 1,000 years was beginning to crack from within. And what did artists do with that? Some fled into the past, others dove headfirst into the doubt, and some did both at once, without realizing it was impossible to separate the two. Work in 22. Christ on the Sea of Galilee. Eugène Delacroix, 1854. Delacroix was the greatest name in French Romanticism, a movement that believed emotion was more true than reason, and that conviction appears in every centimeter of this canvas. The apostle's boat is being swallowed by impossible waves. The sky is torn between storm and light, and Christ sleeps at the back of the vessel, completely still while chaos happens around him. Delacroix painted this scene at least 6 times throughout his life. Different versions, different compositions, but always with the same center: the tension between the total uncontrol of the world and the inexplicable calm of Christ within it. They say Delacroix was agnostic, that he painted religious themes not from faith, but from fascination with the drama they carried. But there is something in those repetitions. 6 versions of the same sea, the same boat, the same sleep, that feels less academic and more personal than he admitted. Work 23. 3. Christ in the Desert. Ivan Kramskoy, 1872. 2. Kramskoy was Russian, and 19th century Russia had a relationship with suffering that was almost philosophical. In this work, Christ sits alone in a barren landscape, rocks around him, an ambiguous sky. Neither dawn nor dusk, you can never quite tell. Hands clasped between his knees, his gaze lost at some point that does not exist in the painting. There is no visible temptation, no demon, no angel. There is only a man with his own thoughts. Dostoevsky saw this work at an exhibition and stood before it in silence for a long time. Afterward, he wrote that it was not a religious painting. It was the portrait of any human being facing a decision that would define who he is. Kramskoy spent 4 years finishing this work and said, in a letter, that he did not know if he had succeeded, that what he was trying to capture was something that always stayed one step ahead of the brush. Work 24. Pietà. William Adolphe Bouguereau, 1876. Bouguereau was the most famous painter in France at the end of the 19th century, and also the most despised by the Impressionists, who used his name almost as a curse word. To them, he represented everything wrong with academic art: too perfect, too polished, too safe. But this Pietà is something else. Mary holds the body of Christ with a technical perfection that borders on the supernatural. Every muscle, every fold of fabric, every strand of hair painted with a precision that the photography of the time could not achieve. And on Mary's face, there are no tears. There is something worse: the acceptance of someone who has already passed through the stage of weeping and arrived on the other side. Bouguereau produced more than 800 works throughout his life, many of them on religious themes. But this specific Pietà he kept. He never sold it. It stayed with him until the end of his life. Sometimes the artist knows when he has made something that has no price. Work 25. The Sermon on the Mount. Karl Bloch, 1877. Karl Bloch was Danish, and in an era when European art was turning toward impressionism and abstraction, he made the opposite choice. He painted Christ directly, humanly, presently. In this work, Jesus stands on a hillside surrounded by a crowd that includes rich and poor, old and young, healthy and sick. The light falls on him naturally. No halo, no golden effect. He looks simply like a man who has something true to say. Karl Bloch dedicated more than a decade of his life to painting the life of Christ, producing a monumental series of 23 large works on the Gospels for the chapel at Frederiksborg Palace. Every scene, every miracle, every encounter. What sets Bloch apart from the great masters who came before is not technique, it is intention. He did not paint for the church. He painted for the ordinary person who walked into that space and needed to recognize something familiar in the face of Christ. Work 26. Suffer the little children to come unto me. Fritz von Uda, 1884. Von Uda was German and had studied in Paris, where Impressionism was transforming everything. And he did something no one had attempted before. He used Impressionist light to paint biblical scenes, not in first-century landscapes, in 19th century German interiors. In this work, Christ sits in a simple room with children around him, in a scene that looks like a photograph of everyday life from the era, except for the central figure, who clearly does not belong to that time. The effect is unsettling in a way that is not easily explained, as if Christ had simply appeared on an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary house, and the children were the only ones who did not find it strange. Von Ude returned to this kind of scene multiple times. Christ on a farm, Christ at a poor family's table, Christ in a classroom, always contemporary, always unexpected. Work 27. The Entry of Christ into Brussels. James Ensor, 1888. Ensor was Belgian, and he was furious at the bourgeoisie, at social hypocrisy, at official art, at politics, at almost everything. And he channeled all of that fury into a canvas 4 meters wide, one of the largest ever painted in the 19th century, where Christ enters a modern Brussels riding a donkey, surrounded by a crowd of carnival masks, grotesque faces, political banners, and pamphlets. No one recognizes him. No one stops. The crowd continues celebrating around him as if he were just another element in the parade. Ensor submitted this work to the Brussels Salon. It was rejected, considered scandalous, blasphemous, and technically incompetent. He kept it in his own studio for more than 20 years. And when the art world finally changed enough to understand it, the work was recognized as one of the most prophetic of the 19th century. Sometimes the work is right, and the world simply needs time to catch up. We have arrived at the end of the 19th century, and something had changed irreversibly. Artists no longer needed the church to paint Christ, no longer needed a commission, approval, or institutional protection. They could choose this theme for entirely personal reasons. And that is precisely where things became most interesting. Work 28. The Yellow Christ. Paul Gauguin, 1889. Gauguin had abandoned everything: his job, his family, Europe, the civilization he called rotten and empty. And it was in Brittany, surrounded by peasant women who prayed with a devotion that Paris had forgotten, that he painted this. The crucifixion takes place in an autumn Breton landscape. The colors are impossible. Christ is literally yellow. The fields are orange and red. The sky is an almost aggressive blue. Three Breton peasant women kneel around the cross with the naturalness of people who do this every Sunday. Gauguin was not painting a historical event. He was painting faith as he saw it in those women, alive every day, integrated into the land. And at the same time, he was painting himself. In letters, he wrote that he identified with Christ, not out of religion, but out of solitude, the feeling of carrying something that no one around him could see. Gauguin also painted other versions of Christ in this same period, always with that fusion between the sacred and the autobiographical. Art, when it is honest, always reveals more about the artist than about the subject. Work 29. The Lord's Prayer. James Tissot, 1886 to 1896. Tissot was French, famous in London for elegant portraits of Victorian high society. And then, in 1885, he went through an experience he himself could never quite explain, one that completely changed the course of his life. He abandoned the portraits. He traveled to Palestine 3 times. He studied the geography, architecture, clothing, and customs of the first century with an archaeological obsession that frightened those around him. And then he spent 10 years producing more than 300 works on the life of Christ, each one with a historical rigor that no artist had previously attempted. The Lord's Prayer shows Christ teaching the prayer to his disciples in a landscape that looks like a photograph of the real Palestine. It is not idealized. It is not golden. It is a human moment, simple, almost domestic. Tissot said he was not painting religion. He was trying to discover what actually happened, and whether that project of more than 300 works was obsession, faith, or searching. Perhaps all three blur into a single point that has no name. If you have made it this far in this video, 29 works, centuries of history, each artist with his secret and his humanity, then you are exactly who this channel exists to find. Subscribe here. Turn on the notification bell, because this is what we do every week, diving deep into art, into history, into everything the great creators left behind that the world has not yet stopped to truly understand. And if you know someone who loves art and history, send them this video right now. No hesitation, just send it, because there are 2 more works on this list you cannot miss. Work 30, Christ and the Sinners. Emile Nolde, 1926. Nolde was German and expressionist, part of a movement that believed art should reveal the interior reality, not the exterior one. His colors were violent, his figures were distorted, and his biblical scenes were disturbing in a way the church never approved, and that museums took decades to understand. In this work, Christ is surrounded by sinners with faces that look like masks, distorted, intense, almost inhuman. There is no judgment in Christ's expression. There is something harder to name, a presence that simply accepts what is before it. Nolde produced more than 70 works on biblical themes, and paradoxically, during the Nazi period, he was declared a degenerate artist. More than 1,000 of his works were confiscated. A man who spent his life painting the sacred, judged by a regime as a threat. Work 31. Christ et Docteur, Georges Rouault, 1937. Rouault had been a student of Gustave Moreau, the painter of work number 20 on this list, and he carried into his own work something his teacher had planted: the courage to take the sacred seriously in an era when that was out of fashion. But Rouault went further, much further. His thick black outlines, inherited from the years he spent restoring Gothic stained glass as a child, created a visual language that belonged to no school, neither Impressionism, nor Expressionism, nor Surrealism. In this work, Christ speaks with a doctor, a man of law, of letters, of intellectual power. And Rouault painted that encounter with dense colors and brutal contours that transform a simple dialogue into something almost liturgical. Rouault produced entire series on Christ over decades and refused to sell many of them, going so far as to destroy hundreds of works he considered unfinished just days before his death. A man who spent his entire life trying to paint what he felt, and in the end preferred silence to delivering to the world something that was not yet ready. We have arrived at the end of this timeline. 700 years, 33 artists, 33 attempts to capture something that perhaps no canvas can ever contain. And the last two works on this list are the most unlikely of all. Work 32, Christ of St. John of the Cross, Salvador Dalí, 1951. Dalí was the king of surrealism, provocative, extravagant, celebrated for shocking. And then, in 1950, he had a dream. He saw the nucleus of the atom, and at the center of that nucleus, there was Christ. The following year, he painted this work, a perspective that does not exist in nature. You are above the scene, looking down at the crucified Christ from above, as if you were God watching what happened. The body has no nails, no blood, no crown of thorns. Dalí explained. He dreamed those elements would diminish the image, that the truth of that moment was greater than the physical pain. Below the cross, the Bay of Port Ligat. where he lived. A boat, fishermen, everyday life continuing while eternity happens above. Glasgow purchased this work for £8,000 in 1952. Students protested in the streets. They said it was a waste of public money. Today, an offer of €80 million has already been turned down. Dali had spent years without touching religious themes and returned with a work that redefined how the 20th century could look at Christ. Not with naive devotion, not with cynical irony, with the seriousness of someone who dreamed something he cannot ignore. Work 33. Last Supper. Andy Warhol. 1986. Andy Warhol, the man of Campbell's soup cans, of Marilyn Monroe silk screens, the artist who turned pop culture into art and art into product. That name on this list looks like a mistake. It is not. In 1986, 1 year before his death, Warhol received a commission from an Italian gallery owner. Create a series of works based on Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper for an exhibition in Milan, in the same neighborhood where the original hangs. What he delivered disturbed everyone. More than 100 works, versions of the Last Supper overlaid with American brand logos, supermarket prices, images duplicated, triplicated, repeated until they lost their meaning or found a new one. Was it a critique of consumerism using the sacred as a mirror? Was it genuine devotion disguised as pop irony? Was it both at once? What few people know is that Warhol was a practicing Catholic. He attended Mass regularly. He volunteered at homeless shelters in New York without telling anyone. For decades, the man the world saw as the ultimate symbol of contemporary superficiality prayed in silence while everyone looked at the soup cans. He died in February 1987, a few months after the opening of that exhibition. And this series on the Last Supper was the last major work he ever produced. 700 years. From Giotto, who taught art to feel weight, to Warhol, who taught art to question what is sacred in an era when everything has a price. What these 33 artists have in common is not faith. Some believed deeply, others doubted. Others were at war with their own belief while they painted. What they have in common is something else. All of them felt that there was something there. In that face, in those moments of limit and choice, that the world needed to keep seeing. Not because it was comforting. Sometimes it was the opposite, not because it answered questions, it almost never did, but because it asked the right question. There is something strange that happens when you visit these works in museums. It does not matter the day. It does not matter the time. It does not matter if the room is full or empty. In front of these canvases, people stop. with that kind of silence that is not empty, that is full of something that does not yet have a word. Perhaps that is what all these artists were trying to create. Not an answer, not a proof, a space where silence has weight, where you stop in the middle of life, in the middle of the noise, and stay for a second, for as long as it takes, before something greater than you can name. This channel exists because of these conversations. Until the next video.